So here we are. This is the last snapshot for you. As next week, week 13, I will be giving a lecture in Lecture Theatre 5 at noon on Thursday, October 25. Okay, I hope to see some of you there. I will record the lecture, but yeah, for now, let's stay focused on what I'm going to talk about today. History and Futures. We got a great reading from Roman Krishnavic. Here he is, a beautiful book. And I also obviously want to tie some key themes for the course together and so on. Oops, that's not supposed to have happened yet. Yeah. And of course, give you a bit more of an insight into the way my brain works and why I've structured the course the way I have and so on. I've got to put that on so I don't look so mysterious. Well, I still look mysterious even though I have turned the light. So that's because the outside, it's a lovely, glorious sunny Saturday morning here. So anyway, we're looking at Petra here. Petra is in Jordan. It's a relatively ancient civilization, new by comparison to Egypt, of course, but you know, it thrived during the centuries either side of the time that Jesus lived. He may even have gone shopping there, who knows? Not that it's ever mentioned in the Gospels or anything, or not to my knowledge. If I'm wrong, can someone let me know? But, you know, Petra is an example of a society that worked collectively towards a vision. They created these incredible mausoleums for their dead. They flourished. Economically, they were just in the right spot at the right time to capitalize on the webs and so on that of trade that McNeill and McNeill would exalt. They had a very specific and unusual Nabatean religion, which was their collective thinking, their imagined orders, their collective will to find meaning in the world that is culturally significant to them. And I think that's really important to understand, that, you know, what is culturally significant is often local, but it can have global repercussions. For instance, the cultural significance of European imperialist, capitalist, colonialist sorts of thinking obviously had global repercussions. And that's one thing that Krishna, in his Good Ancestor book, is keen to emphasize, is that our individual human actions, choices and everything have a cumulative wave-like potential. Yeah. So I want to, though, turn to that slide that just flicked up momentarily here, because one of my heroes, Bruno Latour, died last week. And he was only in his mid-70s, I think. Yeah, 1947 through to 22. So, and Bruno Latour has been quite significant in the way I think and play with ideas, because he's very much of that European philosophical tradition where playing with ideas is important. It's not just sort of the hard grind philosophy that you would find in the Western Anglo-American traditions, for instance, which are obviously dominant traditions in our university world, our academic world. But, you know, he wrote this terrific book, which I've had since it came out. I grabbed it very quickly, called Facing Gaia. And, you know, it's beautifully written. And each of these 8 lectures, it says there, takes you on a journey. So I wanted to acknowledge Latour, because I think great thinkers need to be acknowledged. In fact, it was quite funny. I stood outside some sort of lecture theatre in Paris in 2012, where he was giving a lecture, but I'd got there really late because I got lost, because I don't know Paris at all. So, and I didn't have a GPS type thing at the time or any of that. So I did it. I got lost and I got there late, so I couldn't get in, but I knew Latour was inside talking. Going, oh, well. And so I went off and, got myself a coffee or something like that, I think. But yeah, it was a bit disappointing because I would love to have actually sat in the lecture theatre and seen this guy in action, you could say. But what is relevant more than anything for this kind of course, our sort of course, because this guy is one of those people who's affected the way I think and see and process. So he's obviously subtly influenced aspects of the course. What I want to touch on today is just one line from this book. So I've said that, the Earth is a series of systems. We've got the physical systems of the biosphere, the pedosphere, the atmosphere, and so on, but we've got human systems as well, such as the ethnosphere, the technosphere, and so on. And of course, the Earth itself is a nested set of systems within the broader systems of the solar system and the galaxy and the cosmos and so on. So, and because Latour is talking about Gaia, and Gaia is, of course, the Greek Titan mother of, basically from the Greek mythic tradition, the world that we inhabit. She's the mother of Zeus and people like that. She was married. No, they didn't have marriage back then. She and her partner was Uranus, depending on how you want to pronounce it. The schoolboys and girls love to laugh at that name. Hang on a second, I'm getting myself mixed up. So she must be the grandmother of Zeus. Sorry, not the mother of Zeus. Got to slap myself here because I'll read. But the mythic is something that, particularly for the intellectual traditions of Europe, particularly of the intellectual traditions of a certain group of people in France, is a very meaningful context. And as Harari talks about imagined orders, well, Latour is talking about the same sort of thing without using those terms, or that term, should I say. So what he says here is that a system, what a weird animal is that? When we talk about system as though it's something empirical, something that fits within scientific thinking. But he challenges that and he says, look, is it a Titan or is it a Cyclops, some sort of weird, deformed creature, you could say? Is it some twisted divinity? And he's talking directly here to James Lovelock's idea of the Gaia, which is the Earth as having an integrated planetary consciousness, that kind of a super life, a meta life. And he's saying, look, by avoiding myth, the scientists, calling it system and so on, we would land on a false one. In other words, scientific ideas of systems thinking, and this guy, Latour, is, in some respects, you'd have to say, a quintessential systems thinker, but by not actually acknowledging that there's a mythic imagined order involved here, we can get ourselves into trouble. And he says something that I think is really important to understand, that myth and science, as we well know, David Christian makes this point very clear in the introduction to his big fat book on maps of time. As we well know, they speak languages that are only apparently distinct. In other words, science and myth are very much sense-making tools that explain the reality that we live in. So I want to say vale, which is Latin for farewell. But, farewell is what? I mean, I've got his books. I will continue to read them. There are plenty of dead people that I have really wonderful relationships with, as I'm sure you do. There are, of course, dead people that we have, quite antagonistic relationships with. And I don't imagine many of you going around hugging Adolf Hitler or Pol Pot or some psycho like that. But, there are people in our lives don't just disappear because their bodies no longer are in our time, space, reality, right? So let's keep moving because I just needed to acknowledge Latour. as I did years ago when one of my other heroes, Bourdieu, when he died, 2005, and there's been a couple in between, can't think of any more. Bourdieu just popped into my mind. So let's keep moving. And, you know, I recommend you go off, and I'm pretty sure that book's in the library. I would hope it is, but if it's not, fine. There are other books in the library by Latour, which may give some of you some thrills. All right. So I'm mining my own very recent past at the moment. Well, I was even with Latour dying, wasn't I? These are two snaps that I just took straight out of the most recent National Geographic that arrived here, in which they're looking at conservation work in the United States. And so they're saying, look, conservation is about growing relationships. Conservation needs to be about protecting other species along with people. It's about improving our relationships with the non-human world. I think that underpins much of what Krishna is talking about here, you know, that cathedral thinking like an acorn, all that stuff, his ideas and thinking around cultural evolution and so on, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But to me, it is really important to recognize that the main problem we face today is a relational problem. We have a relational problem with the self, our own psyches, and that is at the key to a lot of mental illness and also a lot of violences in the world. But we also have a relationship that's dysfunctional with the natural world. Most of us spend very little time in nature. Some of you may be great bushwalkers and go out camping every weekend, or, you know, live in the so-called bush, which is not the same sort of landscapes that I'm living in here in Witter behind Mullaney. It's actually really authentic. You know, there are problems with that word authentic, but truly true wilderness or wildness, as one guy I quote shortly, Drew, what's Latham, he talks about wildness a lot, and I've just discovered him. So I'm actually finding a lot of recent stuff for me at the moment. But, you know, this sense of wildness that's out there, but no, the wildness is actually in here, you know, and, you know, that's something that we need to look at. And again, that wildness that's in here has a mythic quality. I draw on this book in a little bit in this talk, Song Spirals, where a group of Indigenous women working with some non-Indigenous academics curating an incredible conversation about song lines, song spirals, and so on. But we'll come to that shortly. But what they're saying is outside and inside are coterminous. They flow together. It's not that I have my thoughts in here. My thoughts in here are scripts. That where do they come from? Well, they come from the media. They come from, you know, repetition, because we've learned them through family, friends, communities, and so on. It's very, very, there's the sense, or it's a false sense, and it's quite toxic, really, to think that what's happening in here is totally separate from what's happening out there. It has led to sense of isolation, what the sociologists of the 19th century called anomie, and so on. Alienation in the 20th century, particularly in the Marxist traditions. So we've got a lot going on here that is in one way or another pointing the finger at relationships. And of course, what is global citizenship? It's an acknowledgement of relations between the local and the global. I was going to add another layer in between, which is the meso layer, which is sort of like nations and so on, broader community and networks and so on. Hang on for a second. Smelling my coffee. I can hear some birds twittering and toucans and stuff like this. Is from South America. Yeah, I can hear them. I can hear those birds are just terrific. So, I mean, the thing is, when you have a cup of coffee, the kids playing, families are there collecting the beans on these farms and so on. So you've got a lot happening there. Oh, yeah, the clouds, the mists. Have you ever been to a coffee place? I've been to them both in the Philippines and in Brazil, particularly. They can be, if they're well managed, quite remarkable places. Like when I visited the tea fields of Assam and Darjeeling. Oh, I'll tell you what, really good stuff. So let's keep going because I'm getting distracted. You can tell this is that my brain is almost burnt out, but it's not that. It's just that I'm allowing myself to be myself for you. And I think that's important pedagogically too, that you can see the eccentricities that make up the persona of somebody who's your teacher. So let's keep moving. So Indigenous embodied knowledge. Now that's me drawing on these two wonderful ladies here, Margot Neal and Lynn Kelly. Great scholarship, really reflective, pushing the boundaries and the borders, or the whatever we want to call them, of, you know, what is scholarship. So I want to focus on embodied knowing. That was me mucking about with my coffee, saying, I can hear things. Oh, look at that. I can feel the moisture of the dew on my face and so on. We are not just cognitive beings. Cognition is a whole of body thing, and it's beyond the body. I cognition because I have a relationship with Gil and Caitlin, other academics at the university, Amy Clark, Margaret Cook, Jen Carter, many people whom we co-cognate, you could say. And that's really important to understand. And of course, we're on land, we're on Indigenous land. And that is also meaningful because land is archive for the Indigenous, as it's Margot Neal writing this bit points out. Songs are learnt, all right, as people travel to places named in the song, and the rhythm of walking took the song into the body. Through the body, song became dance, which in turn became ceremony. Painted with signs of the ancestral beings being sung, the dance body, that's right, the dancing body unlocked the knowledge of the master archive. The master archive is the deep knowledge of country. The contemporary practice of painting on canvas derives from body painting and is an extension of such archival practice. For these writers, in that book, Songlines, country is archive. It holds memory, it holds tradition, it holds pasts, plural, presents, plural, and futures. We have to understand that folded time is what this course is about in many respects. Why? Because we're looking at deep time. We're looking at taking the long view, you could say, because we can't understand ourselves, our relationship with the world, the current issues that, you know, strike terror and dismay into us, as well as issues that help us maintain some level of optimism and purpose. Okay, it's all folding in together. So it is geared. Oh, sorry, and that last sentence I just stuck in because I thought it was really important. They note that that Indigenous people are now contemporary practices painting on canvas, right? And is an extension of such an archival practice. It is geared to the sedentary lifestyle. The painting on canvas, I've got a litho behind me, I've got a canvas up there with oils on it and so on, are geared to sedentary lifestyle and capitalist economy of today. Because being sedentary and being a member of the capitalist world they sort of go together. So what do? We acquire things rather than sharing or allowing those things to flow around us in a different way. Each piece on the wall behind me tells a story, you know, and that's important. So I can story myself into being, but I have to make an effort to go out and experience what they're talking about here, which is country. Now, I want to shift focus a little bit. You know, so this Indigenous context is really important. It certainly informs people like Roman Krishnarik's thinking. It informs Yuval Harari's thinking. Graeber and Wengrove, and quite a number of the people that you've been reading over this semester, should I say. But I really want to focus this time on what do I mean by futures, because that's where I work, right? I work with what's called futures thinking often. So this is a shopping list, you could say. So the future's like the past doesn't exist. How do we study the past? Well, like the past, the future leaves marks in the present. So in other words, science, the past leaves marks. So there's Petra, that incredible place in Jordan. The Nabatean don't live there anymore. They don't exist as such. Their culture, their civilization, and much of what made meaning for them is lost to us. We can infer, we can project our contemporary thinking back into time. They could not have imagined a world like the one that we live in. Why? Because they lived in a universe that was mechanistic and very much influenced by the gods, the spirit world, and so on. So, futures thinking fosters adaptive capacity and evolutionary advantage. Thinking that draws on foresight is, assuming that certain things might happen in the future and being ready for them. That's adaptive capacity. It allows us some level of flexibility. If you're a fascist, and we do live in a fascist world, I have to say, you don't want people to think too much about the future. You want people to think that the future is an extension of the present, business as usual. But what happens if it's not? How do we get to be an industrialized society when only 2 or 3 centuries ago we were an agrarian one? Well, some people of influence and money, political power, reimagined the future. They couldn't reimagine the exact details of that future, but they brought in a few innovations to energy, complexity, and collective learning that have brought about our future. That's really interesting. It also gave those people who would think like that increased levels of economic and political power. So it offers and proffers evolutionary advantage. Evolutionary advantage means that if changes happen in the system and they don't help us perform better in the environment, whether it's biologically or cognitively, you're going to fail, or you're going to succeed if it offers you an advantage over others. So technology gave the Western world, that weird world of Joseph Henry, advantage over those who didn't have equal access to that world. So what we have is colonialism and industrialism and economic capitalism all linked together. Futures thinking, of course, we have to acknowledge, is partisan. Putin did his futures thinking with his guys, thinking about how do we take over Ukraine. Because they were delusional and they were using a very distorted historical narrative, they had what the ancient Greeks would have called hubris, overweening pride. They thought, how could that little country, resist the awesome Russian military that smashed the German invasions in 1940s and so on. So they were thinking like this. But they were thinking to seek, they were thinking about critical advantage. The size of their military, the awesome power of their military could, smash Ukraine very quickly. What they've discovered, of course, is that's not the case. Nonetheless, when, good guys and bad guys have tried to work out how we're going to seek advantage in the future, they're thinking from a specific perspective. They're not just thinking of that, well, they're rarely thinking about advantage for all. Some, utopian and social theorists and so on are thinking that way. Some historians are saying, look, if we rewrite history, and I've talked about that in the past lectures, we will gain a more just world. If we can rethink the past, it will improve justice today, and of course feed into hopefully more inclusive societies and social functions and so on in the future. Futures thinking is informed by memory. Putin's a good example of that. That the memory of the past glories of the Russian military, certainly led him to believe that a certain kind of future or outcome of an action, the invasion of Ukraine, was going to lead to, a positive outcome for the Russians, not for the Ukrainians, of course, but who cares about them? Because, the Russians are at the top of a pyramid at which Putin is at the top of that pyramid. So, and of course, he's no doubt initiated all of this in order to hopefully for himself gain some political advantage at home, where, as a dictator, you're always looking behind you to make sure no one's got a knife about to stick into your back. Futures thinking is co-creative. It's one of the things that comes out very strongly from Krishnarik's book. The two snips that I took on conservation from the latest National Geographic, talking about relationship. We can't think ourselves out of this alone. We can think through things like I've thought through this lecture or whatever, and you're thinking through the readings of the course and you're thinking about your final assessment and so on. But, that's all involving the thinking of others. I'm thinking in dialogue with. Dialogue to me is so important, engagement with other people's thinking, because they spark things for myself. I am not a unitary being, despite the fact that when I look in a mirror or do a selfie with my phone, it's around here somewhere, that's the illusion that we create. That's an imagined order, but it's not an imagined order that enables. Hyper-individualism disables, because it means that we don't act in social or collective ways, or we're unaware of the way we're conditioned to behave in collective ways. I might think, I need a new pair of shoes. I'm going to hop in my car, drive individually, solo, lonesome, down to the coast, go to Sunshine Plaza or whatever, jump out, rush in like a commando, because I hate shopping centers, rush in, find the shoe shop I want, grab shoes and come back. That's the sort of thing. But that belies the fact that the whole enterprise, from the car through to the shopping center and, the collective living on the coast, involves millions of people over many, many years, creating the environment in which I can live with the delusion that I'm an individual in that sense. It's not to say that we don't have individuals, that you and I aren't individuals, but it means that we forget. It's kind of sidelined that we are relational beings. Okay, so nearly at the end of my shopping list, I want you to be aware that there are open and closed futures. That's really important. An open future is a future where you and I can make choices about our future, that there are multiple possibilities before us. A closed future is where you and I are told that, well, we can't do anything about the kind of democratic decay that Australia and the world is suffering from. We can't do anything much about the Anthropocene, really. We can't do anything much about people in detention centres or the war in Ukraine or anything like that. If you reduce possibilities, you crush hope and optimism, and you restrict us to more functional behaviours. The open future, which of course I'm a proponent of, and most futurists are, is a future in which there is uncertainty, accident, play, and so on, and mystery, but it's built around a set of values. There are different sets of values that open up or close our future. Okay? The future is colonized as a principle of futures thinking that I think is really important. If you think about the future, think about where you might be in 10, 20, 30 years from now. Think about your relationships then. Think about what the world might be like, given that what we're told by the media and so on. Think about your hopes and so on as well. All of these things come together to shape the kind of future that you might think. So if let's say if you're a 20-year-old, you're thinking, well, in 20, 30 years' time, I'd like to have a house, a family, a secure income and so on. That's business as usual futures thinking. What about 20 or 30 years from now? As a 20-year-old, you'll be, 50, let's say. You may have started your own business, you know, been involved in some really important social activism that's, you know, created, you know, major positive environmental changes on the coast or in Australia or somewhere overseas. You know, you might be involved with supporting Indigenous people's rights overseas. That's Livia Philortico, the very first conversation that we had. You know, whatever it might be, that future will bring greater levels of agency, meaning that you can do things beyond that business as usual parameter. There's some agency in the business as usual parameter. If you have your own house and you know, a lovely family, everything, when you're 50, I want to go for a holiday. I'm going to go to Cairns and enjoy the Great Barrier Reef if it's still around. But, you know, that's the sort of thinking that happens there. But however we want to see it, the future is colonized by principles that we've inherited from the past and from messages from the present that we inhabit. That's really important to understand. So it's colonized often by the negative. That's also to be acknowledged. But so part of the futures work, part of what we're doing in a course like this, I'm talking about optimism all the time. Everybody that I've talked to in those 12 conversations, I've said to them specifically, what gives you optimism? Knowing, of course, that these people are all in one way or another social innovators, educators, a couple of them are even futurists in that technical sense of the term, Jose Ramos, Amanda Reeves, you know, but others come from other domains, but are doing equally what I would consider optimistic and futures-oriented work. Futures thinking, obviously, if it's colonized, well, we have to decolonize. So we have to unlearn, decolonize, and remember. In other words, we have to do historical work like this, historically reflective work, in which we are looking at the processes that generate the way we exist and live and think, and even our emotional responses, our physical responses, what do we hope for, and so on, what excites us, what terrifies us, and so on. These things all need to be reconsidered. And a course like this, you know, I've designed it so that I give you some access to tools that you can bring to bear. Energy, complexity, and collective learning. Absolutely basic, broad social tools. What does that mean? Well, it could mean, well, I've got some great tools to look and analyze and deconstruct that. But it also may mean that it helps you mobilize your energies in ways that are going to bring about more enriching futures. So, the last point for my shopping list is about futures thinking as belonging. What do we long for? What do we aspire for? Belonging is about being at home, but where is home? Australians have classically, in one of the historical things I used to use years ago, been referred to as the unsettled settlers, that somehow white Australians are not particularly at home in their own skin, in their own privilege. That's because one aspect of Australian social psychology is that we feel somehow, that we have benefited because others have lost. In other words, Indigenous Australians have their societies, their cultures have been severely degraded. Not just that, the land that we're on is not the land that our ancestors came from. 4 or 5 generations might seem a long time, but it's you know, a blink of an eyelid. So what makes us unsettled, and how do we belong in a world as global citizens? It's about finding a new way to express our relationship. It's not, of course, that I'm totally in love with Australia and the continent of Australia, not the politics, nationalism, that stuff turns me off. But I'm in love with this world, this environment. And when I come back here from overseas, I just go, we just live in paradise. Of course, we're in paradise because Sunshine Coast is one of the best places in Australia, in my humble opinion, to end up, you know, being marooned. Because, you know, I wasn't born here. I'm not a local. I've been here for 30 years. But 30 years is nothing. It might be your lifetime, mind you. Sip coffee. Hear those birds. But it's about belonging and longing. We long for things. what is because optimism, hope need to be loosened from, I just want a nice home and a nice car and a nice job, which is the way capitalist materialism channels us. What about those other things, that call us, that are less tangible, more cultural, more spiritual, perhaps? These things are important, and we don't need to put labels on them. Though I've noted that, Renee Joseph, whom I spoke to this week, she links her practices as visual artist and as an educator with her Christianity. And I don't touch on it much here, but that faith-based importance is really important, because it's where we turn to for meaning. And a lot of us channel our longing for things beyond ourselves, the less tangible stuff, through faith-based practices. If you're a materialist secular Aussie, you'll probably channel it through going surfing or bushwalking or whatever. There are different modes for it, but because this course is actually not really dealt with faith-based stuff at all, it was really important to me to, and when I was talking to her, I suddenly realized you're the perfect person for one of our conversations. I hope you enjoyed that conversation, by the way. So then, past, presents, and futures. It's a very important idea. They fold together. There's no beginning and there's no end to them. Here we are in the present, but yesterday is now the past, okay? Some of you were working because you had part-time jobs. Others, might be mum or dad to kids and you were taking them somewhere, picking them up from school. What are the futures? Well, it's more of the same, plus something extra special. The whole point for me about this course is that poly temporality is playing out. Poly temporality means we don't just live in one temporal timeline, okay? Aboriginal Australia, white Australia, whatever the next stage is for our futures, or I was born then, I was a teenager then, that linear stuff is micro historically useful, but it's not useful in terms of understanding how we live in multiple temporalities. The fact that I've got song lines here, the song spiral book here, good answer to there, means that, and they were all written at different times, but they're also talking intertemporally. They're talking between one another. I can put those two books together. Hello, how are you going? So that they come from different people, but they're talking, the Indigenous ones are talking about a totally different way of understanding the human being. And I think that's important. So some key points about polytemporality. They've been implicit mostly in this course, but it's worth touching on as we're going to, this is the last of these lectures, that that the linear is what has mobilized the energies of modernity, but it hasn't helped the planet, and it hasn't helped many of the planet's human population, and it hasn't helped many of us individually either, for that matter. Futures thinking approaches time as a folded experience, in my image here, which was created by one of our USC honours students for me many years ago, and it's in a publication I wrote on heritage futures, and it's also on my arm as a tattoo, just because I think embodiment is important, right? Agency is distributed throughout the temporal system. It's really important to understand that agency, what you and I can do as individuals, is distributed, because as you and I engage with the past and we rethink the past, we are still having agency within that past. It's not that you and I have time traveled. Tom Griffiths has written a book about that. He's a great Australian historian. It's not that you and I have physically time traveled back into the past to say, Captain James Cook, stop, go away, don't come here. This should be left, as untouched Indigenous Australian country. We can't do that, but we can rethink and re-engage with representation of the past in the present. If you're interested in that idea, which possibly sounds a little outlandish, History 300 is with me, is where you need to jump in, and we talk a lot about that. There are human agents, but we don't stand alone. In other words, there's the non-human as agents as well. The way climate is now forcing us to rethink our industrial economic activities on the planet. So agency is logical, mutual, and co-creative, just like the folding nature of the image here is dialogical, folded, mutual, co-creative. We're going to talk more about that in this little lecture. COVID and climate change both remind us that humanity are not soloists in the universe, that we're actually surrounded by multiple species, organisms, and material realities. Only material if you're a materialist. You know, if you're a promoter of James Lovelock's idea of Gaia, everything is conscious and sentient. But that's also part of many non-Western faith bases as well. Hinduism and Buddhism, see that. But Indigenous Australians talk about country as a living extension, or they are the living extension of country. It's not the other way around. Or is it folded? Possibly. So I'll breathe out for a second. So I want to talk a little bit about intimacy then. So if we have a relationship with the sky and the moon and the stars and also, of course, people around the planet, animals, the more than human, we got to understand that both the pasts, plural, and futures, plural, meet in us, physically in us, our bodies in the present. Now, that's an awesome idea for me. I just go, wow. And of course, a lot of my groping around in these funny sort of little talks I do for you is about how do I represent that? You know, and what does it really mean for me? Well, one thing it meant that I've done training in a group process called Interplay, which is about performance, dance, movement, and so on. And I use it in my workshops extensively. It also means that I want to, because I'm a scholar, an academic, I'm wanting to represent that in different ways in my own work. So global citizenship, I say here, is not simply the present, but it's across time. Why have I talked so much and asked you to look at the Long Time Academy and so on? It's because we don't just exist in the present. We need to start developing an intimate relationship with the deep past and the deep future. Okay, so quoting myself, which I rarely do, but you know, I am going to do. So I'll stop apologizing for it and just get into it. So the core argument for me is that the future, of course, and the past are zones of possibility. They lie on our skin like gold dust. They penetrate our senses because our senses are conditioned by everything from the food we eat to the kind of media we consume to the actual just frequency of our time. Okay, they shape the way we express and vocalize our past, present, and future's consciousness. And it's about that awareness, that consciousness of things. So I want to suggest to you that the history is not just out there, that it's in here. The future is not just out there, it's in here. And how does that affect us? How do we live a sense of time fullness? That's really important. I'm saying that it's not a rhetorical question, but it's something I want you to think about, because I can answer it in my way, but it might not be your way. And of course, we have to say that if you're driving, you can be thinking about something that happened 10 or 20 years ago, and you can be planning for the meeting you're going to have in the office or whatever it is. But you also have to be very much in that moment. Otherwise, you're going to crash the car and kill people or yourself or both, you know. So there is also a demand for us to be in the present. But that demand of being in the present doesn't mean that we give away the pasts or the futures before us and around us. So I asked you to have a look at this fantastic little reading by Joseph Drew Lanham, okay, on convergent imaginings. It's a short little paper, probably takes you 5, maybe 10 minutes to read if you dwell on it like I tend to. I tend to stop and go, oh, wow, that's fun. And then I sort of go off on some thought experiment of my own, and then I come back to the reading. But this guy, he did something that I was doing 20 or 30 years ago, but of course I never made any money out of it. I just did it because it was a thought experiment. I wrote letters in the voices of other people for a little magazine that I was part of. But he writes a letter from Martin Luther King to Rachel Carson, and then he writes a response. What's interesting, of course, is that both of these people lived at the same time, but they never met. Martin Luther King, you know, was leading a key voice in the movements for Black recognition and so on in the States. Rachel Carson was an advocate for, she was also a biologist, for, respect for nature. So both of them were advocates in different ways. They come from different, they were both American, but come from different cultures. He reflects on all that and he imagines, well, what would have happened? What kind of magic might have happened if these two had met rather than living parallel lives in the United States? So when I read these lines, I thought, I've got to share it with as many people as possible. So I'm sharing it with you guys, so forgive me. But circumstances dictate chance. And chance is really an interesting concept. Chance fosters possibilities. Another interesting concept, possibilities. I've already used the word talking about futures thinking. Could a conversation, let's say between those two, create its own momentum? This is the convergence coming together. This is the relational. Could separate suddenly become conglomerate? Again, the relational, with a greater mission. So this is what happens. So, I don't bemoan social media. I mean, I bemoan the fact that the worst of us can appear there, but I also celebrate the fact that amazingly positive outcomes arise from social media, Twitter, or whatever. So imagining the power of relational action and relational thinking, not just imagining it really, but knowing that imagination is another form of the real. It's not fantasy like a Disney flick or, something. It's actually something, it's a commentary on the real. Lord of the Rings is not just a fantasy novel. The works of Ursula Le Guin, fantastic. They're not fantasy novels. They are novels that explore the real, through alternative realities. Who's to say whether they exist or not? Okay, so let's keep moving then. So how do we get convergence? Convergent thinking is a great illustration here of convergence. Well, you've been given 10 or 11 readings, and you've got one more to go for next week, but that's more just fun for next week's one. The only thing, when I typed this out today, I suddenly thought, oh my God, there's not one woman there. Flat. I'm drawing on women all the time as I offer you narratives and so on. And I thought, well, why? Well, one of the key reasons is that the thinking that's going on in relation to this course, you would have to say in some respects is very male. I'm not saying that derogatively of the male. It's just that it's often men who tend to write about the abstract. That's part of the European tradition. And it's women who will write about the intimate. These books on the song lines and the song spirals, they're intimate. It's really interesting. They don't even name themselves. If I hold that up to you, I don't know if you can see it. The Gaia group of women. They say inside, if you read the preface or introduction, they say who they are and they talk about the relational constellation there. But it's not so much about the name as the product. David Christian, he's a product. If you're a big historian, he's almost like your guru. Yuval Harari has a lot of, punch in terms of his presence in social media and, what he says matters. If you look at the number of YouTube clips on him, his commentaries on the Ukraine and so on. The William and John McNeill, they are more niche. David Graeber, he's an absolute cult hero. He died as a result of complications from COVID in 2020. He was about to turn 60, I think. But particularly Graeber. Wengrow is less well known. Rutger Bregman, he's another, stellar one. But they're all writing with a certain kind of voice, a voice that's very useful for this course. But I keep saying, go back to your realities. Test these ideas in the worlds that we inhabit. That's what good history is about, and good scholarship too, for that matter. It's about testing things. But nonetheless, whether you look at their work or you look at the work of the Gaia group of women and others, something is emerging. There is a kind of convergence around advocacy for inclusivity, advocacy for the other, advocacy for the non-human or more than human, advocacy for nature and Gaia, and so on. There are conversations occurring because the moment is pressing down upon us, and that's forcing convergence. But, you know, if you talk to Gil or Caitlin about this, they will say that, you know, this course has morphed a lot over the last 15 years, and it's morphed quite simply because the conditions in which the teaching is occurring, not just the medium through which is occurring, me giving you these talks, but the conditions around it have led to an upswell of people, really good thinkers, writing speculatively about the past, the present, and the futures. Okay, if you look at the dates of publication, just go through the lectures, and I recommend you do. Go back to the PowerPoint, not necessarily spend all that time listening to me going blah, 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 but have a listen. No, don't have a listen, have a look at the PowerPoints. Look at the dates of which the publications are coming from. David Christian, his is relatively old. It was, what, 2003. Harari, his book on Sapiens came out 2014. McNeil, that's an old one too. That comes around the year 2000. Graeber and Wengrow is the year 2020. Bregman, I think, is 2019. Henrik is 2019, 2020. Kurlansky, that's, you know, a decade ago, early like 2011 or 12. Hawthorne, not because he's the dinosaur amongst all of these guys. Hawthorne, who's been dead for 20 years, maybe. No, I'm not sure when he died. But the little reading you had last week on the New Century was published in 1999. Krishna, his book is 2020. So you have a look at you can see that, you know, there are outliers, there are early birds, you could say, to the party, but many of them are younger academics. They're probably in their 40s. Graeber and Wengrow are in their 50s. You know, William McNeil, he's been dead since the 80s or early 90s, I believe. He's certainly been dead for quite some time. Osborne, as I said, has also died. But the others, you know, are all feisty, living well, and they're between, let's say, 40, 45 and 65, 70 years of age. What's important, drawing on this, the convergent imaginings that Drew Lanham talks about, we have convergent thinking, and we personally, I can see, I'm hoping you're starting to see strong similarities between these writers and their thoughts. So we're coming towards the end now. Just touching on that book, Song Spirals by the Gaia Group of Women. I really like this because the course started out with, maps of complexity. So these women say, look, song spirals are maps. That's worth thinking about. But they are more than maps too. How a person and a clan, people, connect and relate with and as, not just with, but and as country. We are of the environments that we live in, that we're born into. How people and country are always emerging in relationship, that keyword, with one another, with each other. Everything within country is alive and sentient, and people are part of this vibrance. Affirmation of the potential of our relationalities, plural relationalities. And for most of us of a Western background, denied that kind of rich culture, we don't see that so clearly. We can feel it when we're in nature. Forest bathing, for instance, is terrific. It's really good for our mental and physical health, but there's something special there that I really want you to think about. These people they nail it. They're talking to something that is part of that emergence, that convergence of thinking. So maintenance and good ancestry. Krishna was your reading for this week. He ends that chapter that I asked you to read on cultural evolution with this wonderful image of the chalk horse in the south of England. I've been to one of these and they are quite astonishing. He talks about the rechalking ritual, speaks to us of the value of maintenance. One of the things about the world we inhabit is that we are destructive of it as a culture, as a civilization. Not saying you and I individually, but we benefit from the extractive, colonial, destructive nature of it sits at the basis of our economics. He describes going up there with a group of people to work on the maintenance of the beautiful chalk horse. Okay, so maintenance he links with this concept of good ancestry. Good ancestry involves these things on the side here: deep time, humility, legacy. We think about what is it that we're leaving to posterity? Intergenerational justice. My good fortune. Do you want your great-grandchildren to experience that? Or if you don't have kids, do you want people, 3-4 generations from now to have the same good fortune that we have? Cathedral thinking is about projects beyond our human lifetime. We are making some efforts for the future. They might be major efforts or they might be minimal. Can we think and plan and start social processes that are going to go well beyond our lifetimes? So self-interest is not there. There's a larger sense of self. It's the community, it's the relational self. Can we see and think holistically? That means across systems. Can we be aware of the multiple systems we inhabit? Or can we be thinking in terms of Gaia, using the analogy from the beginning of this? And transcendental goals. Strive for one planet living. Global citizenship is one descriptor for that. For those seeking, and this is Krishna now, to transform long-term thinking to long-term practice, the priority must be that we can do it together, that what we can do together. It's relational. I think that's really important. So, second last slide. Third last slide, maybe I've got a thank you slide, don't I? That's right. So I want you to revisit or visit the conversations. If you haven't listened to them, I invite you, please, to write a message to one of those that you've listened to. These people have given their time freely to me for you. That's really important. They are not thinking of self-interest. They're not being paid for it or anything. I would love to be able to send each one of these people a few messages from you guys that have benefited from their generosity. As to whether that will happen or not, I'm not sure. But, there are different ways that we can do that. But, I'm very much open to receiving some emails from you saying, Marcus, can you please pass this on to Sophia? And you could just say, I really loved your talk, Sophia. I've never been to New York, but, whatever you want to say, really. It's up to you. But I really would invite you to go back over those. They're a resource. Save all the links. That would be worth doing so that you can go back to them and listen to them at different times. So this is the sort of the last series quote. I love this Japanese woodcut. So Krishna has this to offer us at the end of this little talk. History tells us that collective action works. Think French Revolution, think the Russian Revolution, think moving from from the agricultural to industrial, wherever. Think that. Yet drawing a strict line between the individual and the communal, which what I was talking about before, these endeavors is a false dichotomy. There is no individual, there is no community, they are together. The individual has a zone of consciousness, so does the communal. Our personal actions are not pointless, okay, or not a pointless drop in the ocean, for the simple reason that their ripple effects can turn into waves, which of course is why I chose this image, okay? So think about that, read or reread the Krishna reading. It's a very potent reading. It's very accessible. He's a philosopher by training, but he writes in a very accessible way. I want to thank you for coming on the journey with Gil and Caitlin and myself. I chose to end with this, an obsidian mirror found from Chalakuyuk, which is about 8,000-year-old Neolithic settlement. Okay, I want to end with that image because to me, the individual does matter. I'm not saying that the individual doesn't. The communal matters. But one of the things about the trajectory or journey of human society, human evolution, human whatever we want to call that, is the discovery of the self. The first mirrors come from about this time. Before that, people may have seen themselves in pools of water. I'm thinking of the myth of Narcissus, for instance. But, you know, it's about understanding ourselves, looking at the potential of the inner-outer relational pact that we have. This course at ground level 0, global citizenship within a long, deep time perspective, that's what it's about. We call it history because that's what we in the West call that. But it's really more about looking at how have we gone from there to here, coming up with convincing narratives that are not exclusive, but are inclusive of multiple narratives, which is why the course focuses on so many different ways of looking at, you could say, the same problem. Where did conversations happen? How do we respond to those conversations? How are you going to take this inquiry into the future? The inquiry that we have started and mapped out here is not a finite inquiry, it's an endless inquiry. A good global citizen, a conscious human being, is always in dialogue with the stimuli around them. And I'm hoping that you've found real worth in the readings. And I would hope that in the future you go back to some of them as you encounter new intellectual problems in academic world of your degree, but also in the broader world of your relational context, you know, family, friends, work, wherever you might be. Until we meet again, I might meet some of you on Thursday week. I really hope so, because it will be tragic just to have Gil and Caitlin in the audience and nobody else. But, you know, I'm also used to that. So we'll take it one step at a time, hey? Okay, so I'm going to stop the share and turn off the recording. Thank you and goodbye. Take care.